We know from research that it is an innate human need to desire meaning and purpose in our lives and in our work. We know that people want a sense of connection and belonging. And we know that people want a sense of connection to something that's bigger than themselves. And I'm going to go into what each of these things mean as we go along. But the interesting thing about this is workplace well-being initiatives up to this point have addressed some of these, but they haven't addressed all of them. And I think we could be taking a more comprehensive approach in workplace well-being to be addressing these three things. What I found last year as I was studying the area of workplace spirituality, and I was studying the scholarship around it, the research that had been done, what companies had been doing, and these are the areas that they've been addressing. And so I endeavored to say, well, what can we learn from them that we could bring more fully into workplace well-being? Now, people like Judd have been talking about purpose for years, and others have been talking about it for years. So these are not new ideas, but I feel like as workplaces are now saying, okay, we are elevating workplace well-being, it's now got everybody's attention, we know that it's important, we're actually starting to see resources and attention being paid to let's shift our strategy. I think there can be a real temptation for workplaces to throw out the baby with the bathwater here and say, let's cast off all of what we were doing before and do the next greatest thing. And I think it's a both and that we need to be doing here. We need to be continuing to do what we know is best practice, but we also need to open and widen and broaden our approach to well-being to include these areas that have been in existence. So when we think about spiritual well-being and spirituality, oftentimes we conjure up an image that looks something like this. We feel like we have to isolate ourselves in a cave or summit some mountain peak and do meditation and yoga. And for sure, if you have access to an experience like this, it could be very transformational and life-changing. But the reality is most of us do not have access to this. And if we do, it might be a once-in-a-lifetime thing. And so the reality is what most of us experience is something that looks a little more like this. We are taking care of our work while trying to meet the demands of life and wedging in our own self-care in between. So how do we, given the realities, address workplace well-being and do that from a more holistic perspective to address what employees really, really need to hear about? So I will talk about what it means to get into the area of workplace spirituality. And I know that if you do decide to broaden your framework to dig into these areas more fully, you will need a business case and you will need to present research. So I'm going to share some research. And I'll also share some real world examples so you can see how companies have been using some of these strategies even during the pandemic. And I'll share some of the results that they've seen. Now, I am going to be skipping a tiny little pebble across the vast ocean with this short presentation. And there's a lot I could share because I've been studying it for a full year, but I do have some free handouts available. So that includes, if you go to the conference app or my website, all of the slides, detailed notes that support the slides, a full list of reference citations, and then out of the 50 or 60 books I read last year, a handful that I think you're gonna really find enjoyable. They were some of my favorites. And people know when they talk with me around the socializing and the reception, I'm going to be recommending books. It's kind of what I do. So I have some book recommendations in there. Before we get into that though, I'd like to invite you to think with me about this. Go ahead and use your camera on your phone and scan the QR code. For those of you who are participating virtually, thank you so much for joining us. You should be able to do this from where you are accessing as well. And just go ahead and respond to the question that comes up. It's going to ask you to fill in a text with a word. And what I'd like you to do is just submit as many times as you want. You should be able to submit more than once. Does everybody have the QR code? Nearly. And the question is, what do you think about when you think about the term workplace spirituality? And just give me whatever comes to mind to you. Don't overthink about it. Just go ahead and give me whatever comes to mind. And we're going to see a word cloud come up. And as people continue to do this and the frequency goes up, we're going to see the numbers getting bigger. And so connection is coming up. Purpose is coming up. Something is coming up. Values. Environment. That's popping. Purpose is getting even larger. More connection. alignment, meditation, environment, religion, yes, and it keeps building. As you watch this continue to build, as I started to talk with people who have been working in the area of workplace spirituality for decades, one of the things that they said is when you talk to workplaces about this term, we know from experience you have to talk terms right off the bat, because there's a lot of different ways of approaching this term, and people come at it with different ideas. And so sometimes the healthiest thing you can do to start and open up the conversation is to simply ask people what they think of when they think of this term. That conversation all by itself actually starts to set things in motion. And we oftentimes have to tease apart these two terms, religion and spirituality. They are for sure very much interrelated and they overlap, but they don't mean exactly the same thing. It's essential for us to understand the difference because in the United States and in other parts of the world, there are laws related specifically to religious discrimination and accommodation. In fact, many workplaces have been fearful of lawsuits and litigation about this, and so they've simply said nothing. They've said we're not touching any of it. And so we have to help them distinguish what is religion versus what is spirituality, and there is a difference. So when it comes to religion, it is about how we think, act, express our beliefs about some connection between us and the divine, or some source, or creator. And it's how we act that out in our lives. Spirituality is related to that, but it's much bigger. It also includes beliefs and values, meaning and purpose, as well as sense of community, and also your sense of worth and identity. And so we know if you ask people about what's important to you, what do you value, what do you believe about who you are and your relationship to that in the world, for many people, religion and a faith tradition is going to come up. And so we do need to create space for this. If we're going to have a discussion with people about these kinds of things, we need to create space and a container for those ideas to be exchanged. But I think we've learned from diversity, equity, and inclusion that it is possible to have these conversations in a way that is respectful, in a way that has boundaries, in a way that leads with curiosity and leads with an understanding. I want to understand your point of view so that it can enrich my point of view, and so that we can understand what we have in common and we can appreciate our differences. Isn't that what we've been doing in diversity, equity, and inclusion? And how can we create an inclusiveness through that conversation? I am interested in your story. You're interested in my story. Let's move forward together and create a new story. And I think we can do that around what is important to you, what do you value? But we can have this broader conversation around spirituality. In fact, the Fetzer Institute, one of my favorite research organizations right now, did a study last year of US adults, and 86% of them said that they had some sense of spirituality when they think about who they are and their identity, that they consider themselves to be spiritual to some extent. Now, that includes people who are religious and spiritual. It also includes people who are spiritual but have no association or affiliation with a religious institution or belief system. There are a small group of people who do consider themselves to be religious but not spiritual. And there's a much smaller group that consider themselves to be neither religious nor spiritual. But 86% of people identified, I consider myself to be spiritual to some extent. And when the workplace says that's not welcome here, but bring your whole self to work, it's a bit of a mixed message, isn't it? Dr. Lisa Miller wrote The Awakened Brain, also on my recommended reading list, especially for anybody in the area of psychology or interested in mental health. She has been a researcher and a clinical psychologist studying this for decades, nearly her whole career. And she has used some very interesting and innovative brain imaging and brain scan research to identify and isolate the very part of the brain, our gray matter, where she and her research teams believe spirituality resides within the human brain. When they ask people if they have a stronger or lesser sense of spirituality and they look at their brain scans, they're different. Those with a higher sense of spirituality have more connectivity, there's more complexity going on, there's more activity going on. And when they look at people with those brain scans compare them to those with a lower sense of spirituality, they find that those with the stronger sense of spirituality had less depression, less anxiety, were more resilient, and had better health and mental health outcomes. And so we have to ask ourselves, if 86% of the people in our workforces consider themselves to be spiritual to some extent, whether they will talk about that or not, and we know from Dr. Miller's research that it is an innate piece of all of us, whether we recognize it or not. It is something that can be grown and developed if we choose to recognize it and support it in people. And so I think when we look at the issues that are emerging and what we've been talking about this whole week, we have to ask ourselves, how can we not address what we're calling workplace spirituality using these definitions? Now, when I look to the research on workplace spirituality, there is no consensus definition. I thought, oh, this will be easy, work will be done in a day. And so I looked through all the research studies and started reading all these books. There is absolutely no consensus across the field of scholarship around workplace spirituality, what that means, religion versus spirituality. And so what I've done is I've taken collections, systematic literature reviews, and I started to look at, well, what things were in common? And this is what emerged. These three elements keep coming up over and over and over again. So while there can be disagreement about how you define it, how you measure it, whether you should in fact define it or measure it, there's a healthy debate going on there. When you look at what has been measured, these three elements continue to come up. And so let's start our conversation there, where there is the research evidence base. And it will continue to grow over time, but this is where we are right now. And so I'm going to go through each of these three elements in the remaining amount of time, which I'm watching very closely. And as I do that, know that although I'm doing each one concurrently, that workplace spirituality is the combination of these three things. These three elements together comprise our sense of identity, our sense of worth, our understanding of who we are and what's important to us in relationship to the rest of the world around us.